just understand what you've preserved for us here in your word. It's in Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen. Okay. All right, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. As we read through this, it's important to remember that Paul is responding to, what most people think is Paul is responding to either letters or inquiries that have been sent to the Apostle Paul from the church in Corinth. And Paul had planted the church in Corinth, and so he had a lot invested in this church. I mean, he had a lot invested in all of the churches that Paul says he was very worry-burdened for all of the churches and cared about what was going on in them, but especially the church in Corinth. This is probably where he spent the second most time of all the churches that he went to, and it seems like he had a lot of correspondence with them. Obviously, we have 2 letters from Paul to Corinth, and when you read between the lines in these letters, you can see where it looks like there were others that just weren't preserved. And I'm sure Paul probably wrote lots of letters to churches that weren't preserved, but these were significant enough that the church decided to preserve them. And 1 Corinthians is a very valuable letter because it's dealing with so many different situations in the church. And as I've said before, the church in Corinth, it almost seems to me like it was crazy town. Like there was just everything you can think of going on in the church in Corinth that had to be dealt with. And these folks were coming out of the world, and they were struggling with what it meant to follow Christ in their context, in their cultural context that they were grown up in and that they had been existing in all their lives. And so they're going to bring all of their cultural context with them into their relationship with the Lord and relationship with the church. And so this ultimately leads to issues because in the Greek and Roman world, there were a lot of things that were permissible that were just flat out ungodly. And so it would probably be hard for someone who's coming out of a Greek and Roman context, especially the context of Corinth, and to come into the church and then all of a sudden have to just change. And many things you would think of as normal were now things that you had to repent of or things that were prohibited. And so this also led to a lot of conflict. And one of those things was that there was this idea of status in the Greek and Roman world that was so important that people brought into the church that led to a lot of conflict in the church. And what Paul is teaching the Corinthians, above all else, is that we have to live according to the gospel. We have to live according to the gospel, and what that means is that ultimately we have to put others first. Just as Jesus laid down his life, went to the cross for all humanity, that this is what we are called to as Christians, to put others first. So much so that in chapter 6, he talking about lawsuits between believers, he says that, why would you even do this? Why not just rather be wronged? That it's more important to love your brother, to love your neighbor. The unity of the church is more important than for you to press your lawsuit, however wronged you may feel. That's how deep it goes for us to live according to the gospel. Now in chapter 7, Paul turns to some issues that are related to marriage, but also sexual purity amongst the members of the church. And this is one of those places where Paul gets down to some nitty-gritty things that hit home for a lot of people. And I know that many of us in this room have been impacted by serious marriage issues, divorce, broken families, almost to a person. And so I think there's a lot of relevant things that are in this chapter for all of us and how we relate to the Lord and how we relate to one another. And also, it's important for us to see that this is something that the church has struggled with from the beginning of the church. It's not something new. Typically, I hear a lot of people talk about the prevalence of brokenness in our families and in our marriages, and acting as if this is something that is a new phenomenon in history. And it's not. It simply isn't. It's something that the church has been impacted by and struggled with. It's something that the evil one has used to try to negatively impact the church from the beginning of the church. And so we see that here in Corinthians. Remember, Corinthians is one of the very first New Testament letters that was written. It's one of the earliest documents we have in the New Testament, which tells us that if Paul's writing about these things in 1 Corinthians, that the church was struggling with these things from the get-go. And so we're going to get into this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. He says, "Now, in response to the matters you wrote about, is it good for a man not to use a woman for sex? But because of sexual immorality is so common, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, because each woman should have sexual relations with her own husband." Okay? So this is right off the bat, Paul is hitting a nerve with the Corinthian church. And he's calling out, first of all, men in the Corinthian church, because in the Greek and Roman world, for a man to run off and have sexual relations with whoever he wants to was normal. It was acceptable. It wasn't even thought about. It's just that's what men do. And it would not have been considered out of the norm. In fact, what would have been considered out of the norm is for a man to be faithful to one woman. That would have been very unusual. So what Paul's saying here, right off the bat to men, is that if you're going to follow Jesus, that you have to let go of this worldly idea that you can just do whatever you want with women. That's worldly thinking. That's evil thinking. And this is an application of what Paul had said earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, which is that your body is a temple of the Lord. And because your body is a temple of the Lord, you belong to Christ. And because we belong to Christ, our bodies are not our own to do it whatever we want. Our bodies are to be used for the Lord. And so Paul is making an application of that principle in chapter 7, verse 1, saying, look, men, that you as a member of the household of God, it's not appropriate to just go and have sex with whoever you want to have sex with. And, we would think of that and think it's obvious, but we're coming from our Christian Judeo ethics that we've been living under for hundreds of years, impacted by the New Testament and Christianity, and we think of it the way we think of it, is that, no, that you're right, it's that we think this is obvious, that a man should not be able to just go and we are sliding away from our Judeo-Christian ethics and our Judeo-Christian understanding of this, and as a culture moving back into a free-for-all. And I think that's what Paul is talking about here. And Paul says, because sexual immorality is so common, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, right? His own wife. Not somebody else's, not a prostitute, not whoever you want to. That you have to be in control of your biological urges. And Paul is saying this, why? Because he's recognizing the fact that sexual immorality is so common in their culture. It's everywhere. It's just like in our culture where it's everywhere, it's right in front of your face, it was probably even more so in their culture. And because of that, people have to have a plan, essentially. Paul's saying you can't just ignore this fact. Because if you just ignore it and you don't think about it, then what's going to happen? You're going to fall into temptation, you're going to fall into sin. You're going to fall into the worldly mindset. Okay? So because sexual immorality is so common, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman should have sexual relations with her own husband. A husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise a wife to her husband. And so this is something actually that Paul's stating is pretty radical for their Greco-Roman context in which they live. Because when he says, look, a man should stick to his own wife, okay, we think once again, okay, that's obvious. That's a radical idea for them because this is coming out of the context where it thinks a man has the right to have sex with whoever he wants to have sex with, and that nobody should be able to tell him what to do. No, Paul's saying, no, as a member of the household of God, you need to be faithful to your wife. It's one man, one woman. But the flip side of that, where he says that a wife does not have a right to her own body, but her husband does. In the same way, a husband does not have a right over his own body, but his wife does. As I can. Yeah. Well, it rains pretty loud. And so not only is Paul just recognizing that there is this marital duty that a husband and wife have to each other, but also this is countercultural. That it goes both ways. It's not just the wife has to serve the husband. In their culture, it was obvious. Yes, of course. The wife is responsible to do whatever the husband says whenever he wants it. Would have been the thinking in a Greco-Roman context. To think that a husband was responsible to the wife, well, that's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. The husband has no responsibility to the wife. And again, for us in our culture, especially nowadays, we see everything as a 50-50 kind of thing. But, and really it shouldn't be thinking it as 50-50, it's more of a 100-100. But to think that in the Greco-Roman context of Corinth in 50 AD, to think that a woman has any responsibility to her husband, or a husband has any I did backwards, that a husband has any responsibility to his wife, that's just nonsense. Everything was essentially about the man and his will and his desires and what he wants. A woman was seen as subservient, that she was just there to satisfy the man. And so Paul's turning it over on its head and seeing it as a mutual thing, that marriage is a mutual relationship. It's not just one-sided in favor of the husband completely and totally. Okay. So, and you can see where a man in a Greco-Roman context could very easily be tempted into spending most of his time just satisfying his own desires. Because he could. And the opportunities were available. And
women were treated as property, just like men were that added function as well. For the rich, for those who owned slaves, they're at the complete will of their masters.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think Paul's talking about slavery here. He's talking about marriage.
Well, I understand that, but yeah. You're talking about the sexual mores of men in the society. Mm-hmm. That's one of their outlets for them to practice an out-of-control lifestyle.
Right. Yeah. So, one of the reasons I think, or one of the many reasons that Paul is addressing this is that he wants the church, first of all, he's calling them to live a life according to the gospel. A life according to the gospel is something in which I am a servant of God. I'm called to love God with all my heart, soul, and mind, but I'm also called to love my neighbor as myself. And to treat others the way I would want to be treated. And, of course, where does that begin? Okay? It begins with the people who are closest to us, right? At home. Which is also, as we all know, maybe the most difficult place to do that. Because as the saying says, and it's true, is that familiarity breeds contempt. Is that when you are living with someone at all times and you're spending the most time with them, those are the easiest people to go off on when you get angry. Oftentimes those are the people that we end up taking for granted or neglecting the most. And so Paul is here calling the church to this lifestyle of conforming to the gospel, of loving my neighbor as myself, of showing grace to others the same way that God has shown grace to me. And he's calling them to actually start practicing this inside of marriage, which would have been a completely foreign idea in the Greco-Roman concept. And I think even really in the Jewish concept, it probably would have been foreign also. So this is to stop treating people as property, to stop thinking that people are just there to satisfy you, and to start thinking about the other person in the relationship, and that you have as much of a responsibility to that other person as they have to you, even if you are a man. So this would have been a radical call that Paul is putting on the men and the women in the Corinthian church. And this is very, very important for a lot of reasons. Not only just that Paul is saying, hey, you need to start acting like a Christian and you just start doing it in your marriages, but also because marriage is foundational to human society. And within the practice of marriage, I think God has actually placed a metaphor or a symbol, a revelation of himself right in creation. And that the scriptures talk about how God has revealed himself in creation. And I think that one of the ways he has revealed himself in creation, probably one of the most important ways in creation, is that he has made us his image bearers. That we, both male and female, are the bearers of God's image. That we exist to, in essence, exude the glory of God and to proclaim the glory of God. And that within human society, when male and female come together in marriage, it actually reflects the nature of God and reflects who he is. Marriage is a fusion of two persons, one male, one female. And it's a fusion of two persons into one thing. And so I think that reflects who God is and what God is like, and to see who he is. And so that God is, in essence, placed that symbol of himself in creation. And so that's why it's such a sacred thing, and that's why it's something that's so important. And I also think that's one of the reasons why the evil one assaults it so hard. That's one of the reasons why the evil one and the forces of evil do everything they can to destroy our marriages and destroy our relationships within our families. And that's why, like I said at the beginning of class, I think almost all of us to a person here have been impacted in some way by the brokenness of marriage and broken homes. And it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Almost nobody escapes it. I think that's because the evil one sees that, and the evil one wants to destroy our marriages. Because when he destroys the marriages, not only is he harming us, and not only is he hurting us, causing us pain, and when those things happen, when we go through that, those people who have experienced it, we know that, what does it do? Anytime we experience this kind of pain, when we experience this kind of brokenness, well, what does it do to us? What does it do to our attitude towards God? Well, there's pain, right? And I think that when people go through the pain of divorce or the pain of separation or the pain of broken home, whether it's the husband, the wife, the children, whoever it may be, I think the tendency is that rather than us drawing nearer to God, it probably pushes us away. At least that's the hope of the evil one. And I've seen it now. It's not 100% true, but it can very easily happen. And the other thing it does is that when the evil one is able to cause us to act in ways that create broken relationships, then it actually harms God too. He is causing pain to the Lord because the Lord feels that pain for us. The pain that we are feeling, the Lord feels it probably 1,000,000 times more because he hates that for us. And I really think that when the Bible says that God hates divorce, which he does, I don't think it's just that what the Bible's saying is that he hates it when we break a rule that's in the Bible. No, that's not what God, I don't think that's the heart of what it's saying. The heart of it is that God feels that pain. God is feeling that pain. He knows the pain. He knows the damage that is doing to his children, and that's why he hates it. Just like I would hate anything that was going to harm my children. And when my children are going through difficult things, and my children are going through pain, and my children are going through brokenness, I hurt. And so does God. Okay? And so I think Paul here in 1 Corinthians is helping us to, again, understand how do we live out the gospel in our lives. Well, this is one of those ways, is that between husband and wife, men and women, that we have to treat one another according to the cross of Christ, which can be very challenging, right? All right, so verse 5, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5 says, "Do not deprive one another, except when you agree for a time to devote yourselves to prayer." Right? So yes, there is this marital responsibility, husband to wife, wife to husband. But Paul's saying also, this is because of immorality. Because of the immorality in the world, that a husband should be faithful to his wife and a wife should be faithful to the husband and not deprive each other, so that you don't subject your husband or your wife to the susceptibility of sin. And that's just a reality, right? And Paul's saying because of that, we need to fulfill our marital duties to one another. But also he says, do not deprive one another except when you agree for a time to devote yourself to prayer. Right? That there are some things that are more important than our biological urges, and that's our relationship with the Lord. And that spiritual discipline is important, and that we can agree as spouses to seek God in prayer, but then come together again, otherwise Satan may tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Right? And this is the problem that Paul sees in the church. The problem is lack of self-control. And we see this throughout the New Testament, where the writers address the church, and one of the things that they address the church about is self-control. In fact, one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. And so Paul is again saying that we need to focus on this and not allow Satan to use our lack of self-control as a weapon against us. Okay? And this would be one of those things where Jesus says to be wise as serpent, innocent as doves, right? Wise as serpents, innocent as doves. That we need to be pure in our actions, but we also need to be wise in how we live, realizing that certain realities are just true, and not to ignore those realities, and not allow our ignorance of certain realities to cause us to have a lack of self-control. Verse 6, he says, "I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all people were as I am, but each one has his own gift from God. One person has this gift, and another has that." And I think what Paul's talking about here, I wish that all people were as I am. I think at this time Paul is single. I don't know that Paul was always single in his life. In fact, I think it's very likely he wasn't, but at this time he is. And Paul says, I wish that everybody was like me, who could be single and stay single so that they could serve God. But Paul says this is a gift. This is a gift that he has been given. And he's using that gift in a service to God. But he says not everybody has that gift. And not everybody is required to do what Paul is doing, which is essentially abstaining from sexual relations or abstaining from having a wife. That's not a requirement to be a Christian. And so one of the things that's going on here in Corinth is that, yes, you have the worldly stuff going on where you have the hedonistic lifestyle of the Greeks and Romans that people are used to and they're living, but you also have the reaction to that, which is a thing called asceticism. Which asceticism is basically you have to abstain from everything. The only way to really have wisdom and to have the best life is to abstain from all physical pleasures. Whether that's sex, wine, you name it. But asceticism would be the Stoic lifestyle. And then there was this contingent of people in the Corinthian church, apparently, who had this Stoic or ascetic mindset, saying that, really, if you're going to be a Christian, you want to be the best Christian possible, then you have to abstain from all sexual relations, even if you're married. And so part of what Paul's writing at here is saying, no, that's not a good idea. That's not really what is required to be a Christian. In fact, marriage is good. Marriage is good. God created marriage. God put man and wife together. Marriage is good. Sexual relations between man and wife, that's also good. In fact, sexual relations between man and wife is something that God created, and it's not something to be avoided. It's something to be wise about. And that if you have, and what Paul's saying here too is it's also not a good idea for husbands and wives to abstain from sexual relations with one another, because what happens is you're going to fall into temptation and you're going to fall into immorality because of that. And so I think Paul is talking to the Corinthian church here about avoiding two extremes. The hedonistic, do whatever you want lifestyle on one side, and the Stoic or ascetic lifestyle of don't do anything on the other. And seeing that wisdom that's in the middle of healthy relations between husband and wife, and men and women. Now Paul says, I'm single, and obviously abstaining from sex, but God's given me this gift so I can focus on my ministry. Now verse 8 he says, I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain as I am. But if they do not have self-control, they should marry, since it's better to marry than to burn with desire, or to burn with passion. So there are unmarried people, widows, and again, Paul brings up this idea, if you can remain single, so you don't have the distractions of that relationship and married life and the responsibilities of that, Paul says that's good. Okay? It's good, there's nothing wrong with that. But only if you can have self-control, right? He says and so if you don't have self-control, then you need to find a mate. You need to find a spouse. And Paul even says it's better to marry than to burn with desire or burn with passion, as some translations say. It's better to marry and to have a healthy place in which your physical and psychological desires can be fulfilled than to burn with passion and again be susceptible to temptation. And once again, there's also nothing wrong with getting married, because the ascetics in the Corinthian church would have said, no, if you are single, then it's a bad idea to get married. Well, Paul's not saying it's a bad idea. It's neither good nor bad. It's just finding it to do it in a healthy manner. Okay. Now, verse 10, he says, to the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. Okay. And again, this is talking about something that was quite common in the Greek and Roman world, was that when people didn't want to be together anymore, they would just leave. And Paul's saying that a wife is not to leave her husband, and I think that what he's talking about here is actually in the context if you have one person who's a believer and another person who's not a believer. That don't use that as an excuse to leave someone. A wife is not to leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled. And so the goal is always reconciliation. The goal between two people should always be reconciliation. Why? Because that's the gospel mindset. The gospel mindset is, I want to be reconciled. Why? Because God has reconciled me to himself. And once again, it's me living out my faith, my relationship with God in my marriage. And also, again here, he says, a husband is not to divorce his wife. And in the Greek and Roman concept, and even in the Jewish context, and we see this even in the conversations that Jesus has with the Pharisees and Sadducees, where a man could just basically say, you're out. He didn't have to have a reason. You're out. I don't want to be married to you anymore. You're gone. And then the main reason that people would do that was essentially committing adultery through divorce, where if somebody's like, well, I don't want to be married to you anymore because I just want to have this person, then I get rid of you, now I have this person. And when I get tired of the next person, well, I'll get rid of you and go to the next person. And so essentially people would just commit adultery through the divorce courts. And so Paul's saying, no, that is not how we live as the people of God. That's not the Christian mindset. The Christian mindset is that we stay together. But it's not, again here, I don't think Paul's saying stay together and be miserable forever. Paul's saying stay together and be reconciled. Be reconciled to God. Be reconciled to one another. Which is challenging. Because, when we live in marriage relationships, you're going to have conflicts. Right? Shocking, I know. I know. It's hard to believe. And I know that you guys probably think, that Tracy's the luckiest woman in the world. Right? To be married to such a caring, compassionate, and understanding person like myself. Right? I'm waiting for the book to be thrown here. But obviously, yeah. Well, I always tell people, Tracy and I, we just celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary, and I think that, it's because of our relationship with the Lord that we've been able to reconcile with one another, because obviously we've had conflicts, a lot of conflicts. And in those conflicts, we've been able to overcome those conflicts and be reconciled to one another. And so we have to practice reconciliation in our relationships as much as possible and do what we can to love our neighbor in our spouse.
It said something about symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
Way back in the and preacher once told me that God made your wife from your side. Didn't make her from your tailbone or your heel. Made her from your side, which is where she is intended to be. And if you use that, implement that, don't you love?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the things that Paul's challenging these Christians here in Corinth with, is to see your spouse as someone who is, how do you say it, I guess, well, what Paul would say in Philippians to the church in Philippi, Paul says, you need to consider others' interests more important than your own. Right? That's how a Christian should treat other people. That's how you should treat other Christians. You should treat others as your interests are more important than my interests. Because that's what Jesus did. Jesus left the throne of glory. Even though he was in the very nature God, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or held on to at all costs, but he emptied himself and became nothing. Became a servant unto death, and death on a cross. That's what Paul says in Philippians chapter 2. And he says, you should have the same attitude as that of Jesus Christ. And so we have to also project that towards our spouses. And in our society, I don't think it's much different than it was in the Greek and Roman society, to where many people see marriage as just a vehicle for self-fulfillment. In other words, I'm going to marry you because it works for me. Right? Now, obviously, we want to be attracted to the person we get married to. Right? I mean, there's obviously an attraction there. Physical attraction, psychological attraction, we have an attraction there. But oftentimes we see it as, this does something for me. That's why I'm going to do it. And then as soon as it's not doing anything for me anymore, now I'm just not willing to put the work into it. I'm not willing to consider that other person's interest as better than my own. And so that's where we get into real trouble in our society. And we have to see all people as those objects of love, which love is seeing the good in that other person or what that other person needs and acting to fulfill that good. The problem is, of course, we can very easily be deceived into thinking that, well, I don't have to do that here because of X, Y, and Z. And we start to build resentments. We build resentments, and then we start to harbor our resentments, and our resentments become the platform upon which we live rather than the gospel of Jesus Christ. Okay? So there are many challenges to it, and it's not an easy thing to live out. So in 1 Corinthians 7:12, in verse 11 he says, the husband is not to divorce his wife. Okay, this is, again, a radical thing that Paul's saying. Look, you as a man don't just have the right for any old reason just to send your wife packing. But I, not the Lord, say to the rest, if a brother has an unbelieving wife and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. Okay, so here is believing husband, unbelieving wife. So he says, you can't just send your wife packing for any reason, and even if she's an unbeliever, you can't just kick her to the curb because she's an unbeliever, where people would say this, that, well, if you're a Christian, she doesn't want to become a Christian, then you don't have to stay with her. No, Paul's saying no. You are married to that person, and if any brother has an unbelieving wife and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. If any woman has an unbelieving husband and she is willing to live with her, she must not divorce her husband. Okay, so Paul's saying, stick with it once again. Be reconciled. For the unbelieving husband is made holy by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy by the husband. So the one spouse is a Christian, the other is not. The one who is not actually benefits from the one who is. Where Paul says this idea, the one who is made holy or the one who is sanctified, that there is a sanctifying effect on the family from the person who believes. That the person who has believed is blessed by God, and that the unbelieving people who live in that household are going to share in the blessing of this person who does believe. And the opposite is also true. What Paul will say later on to the church is that some of you are actually sick and dying because of your unbelief. So it seems as if there's this sanctifying effect on the family from the person who believes. So Paul's saying, don't just jettison the marriage just because one person believes and the other doesn't. For the unbelieving husband is made holy by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. You see, once again, the children in that family are actually going to benefit, and there's going to be a sanctifying effect on the children because of the believer. Think about that. If you have, let's say, a husband and wife, and they have children, and the wife becomes a believer, well, how are the children going to benefit? How will the children of that family benefit? Okay. She will be emulating Christ, first of all. As Paul's calling her to here in this chapter, to love her husband, to demonstrate what it means to love her husband, and what else? I mean, how else will that family benefit?
Teaches them love.
Okay, it's teaching the children too, right?
Teaches the children how to love.
Yeah, it's showing the children how to love, but also the children are going to have the opportunity to learn the gospel, right? The children are going to be taught. You know, oh, our alarm's going off. So there's this effect of the gospel in this home, right? And remember, the gospel is pictured in the writings as the seed that grows. And so here you have the gospel in this home doing its work. And if there's one person in that home who is faithful to the Lord and is living faithfully to the Lord and is actually living out this sanctified life, there's going to be this huge effect on that family for the good. And they're going to be blessed. Now, he says, if the unbeliever leaves, let him leave. A brother or sister is not bound in such cases. God has called you to live in peace. Right? That if someone's going to leave you, you can't stop them. And I think this is something that we see even in our relationship with God, is that if we're going to walk away from God, I mean, does God stop us? You have the opportunity. You can walk away from the Lord anytime you want. Now, I don't recommend that, right? But it is something that we have this free will where we can walk away from the Lord should we choose. And the same is true of our spouses, is honestly, we can't stop them. That if a person doesn't want to live with me, I can't make them do it. I can't make them participate in this relationship if they don't want to. And so, but he says, we've been called to live at peace. And I think this is just like it says in another place in the scriptures, that as far as it is possible for you to be at peace with all people. And once again, this is with our spouse. We should do everything we can to be at peace with our spouses, that there be peace in our family. But I could still do everything. I could do everything possible to be at peace with someone, and they could still hate me. And it just says I could do everything possible to be at peace in my marriage, and my spouse could still decide to leave. Because that's just reality, right? Is that we're not perfect people. Things don't always go exactly the way they're supposed to go. In fact, normally they don't. And so we have to deal with that. We're not dealing with a perfect system, right? And I think the Lord recognizes that. And so we have to understand that things are going to happen. And I think that, yes, we're called to be at peace. We're called to practice the gospel in our lives. We're called to love our spouses and do everything we can. We're called to put their interest ahead of our interest. But the reality is, I'm not going to do that perfectly. I mean, I would be a fool and a hypocrite and a liar if I was standing up here and say I did that perfectly in my marriage. And none of us are going to do it perfectly. And even if we do it to our best, the best possible, it still doesn't mean that the other person is going to accept it. Because, I don't know if you noticed this in this world, but you can do a lot of good things for people and be nice to them, and they will still hate you. That's why we have the saying in our language that nice guys finish last, right? Nice guys finish last. Because that's true. Because when you're nice to people, rather than them saying, oh, thank you, I really appreciate this, and reciprocating that, no, what they do is they take advantage of it. That's just reality in a broken world. And so that happens in our marriages also, is that we can do everything right, we can be as loving as we can possibly think of, and still our marriages can fall apart. And that doesn't even factor in sin, right? Because yes, people are tempted and people fall into sin. One spouse or another can fall into sin. And by sin, I'm not just talking about sexual immorality either, because one spouse or another can fall into sexual immorality and it can break apart our relationship. One spouse or the other could simply fall into a hateful heart and make it impossible to live with that person. So there's a myriad of things that can break up a perfectly good marriage. Our responsibility as believers, as those who have been touched by the grace of God, is to, as much as possible, project that grace onto other people and try to preserve the marriage as much as possible, because it is symbolic of the Lord and it's sacred to God. Now, I just want to say this one thing before we quit, because we're out of time. And then Paul says here, verse 16, for all you know, you might save your husband, but you don't know. You don't know if you're going to save your husband, and for all you know, you might save your wife, but the opposite is also true. You don't know that you're going to save anyone. Okay? And so things can happen. As I said at the beginning of class, many of us here have experienced the brokenness of divorce and broken homes and marriages falling apart. Is that what do we do in those circumstances when we do experience that? Is, once again, we fall back on the grace of God and understand that we are under grace, not under law. And that God knows who we are, God knows what we have done, and Jesus Christ went to the cross for all of it. And that we turn to God anytime we experience brokenness. We turn to Him and we lean on His grace. And from wherever we are, we start to do the next right thing. We start to trust God. And as much as possible, try to be at peace with one another and to live that gospel-shaped life. Okay. All right, any comments or questions before we stop? Not much has changed, actually. And as Chuck said earlier, I think that we are coming around now in the circle of history. As it says in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. We're coming back around now in this circle of history. And who knows, maybe we've gone around a couple times. But here we are. We live in a culture now where essentially anything goes. And you do what you want. And there's no shame in it. And so we just have to be aware of that and understand, what does it mean to live as people who are faithful to Christ Jesus in that kind of culture. And what that means is that I live my life according to the holiness of the Lord, and as much as possible, I am gracious to others in the same way that God has been gracious to me, so that I can be purified. All right, we'll stop there.